the night the storm swallowed Grayford Hollow. The town thought it was just another blackout. But inside a burned-out shack on the edge of the woods, a scarred veteran and his aging dog face a truth that had been buried for years. Secrets of betrayal, a war that never really ended, and a powerful enemy who would rather see the whole town burn than let the past resurface. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was a battle to decide whose story would be remembered and whose would be silenced forever. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this? And where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Morning in Grayford Hollow comes in low and slow, like a blanket somebody forgot to shake out. Fog drifts between tired porches and leaning mailboxes. The air smells of wet leaves and old diesel from the mill road. Somewhere a church bell tests a single note and gives up. On the far edge of town, a weathered shack sits half swallowed by scrub pines, its roof patched with tin that pops when the sun finally finds it. Silas Harlow steps out with a chipped mug and the dog at his heel. Grim, gray around the muzzle, eyes still sharp, pads close enough that his shoulder bumps Silas's leg with every other step. Inside, a narrow workbench waits. Curls of cedar, a coffee can full of nails, a hand plane he rubs down after every job like it's a habit that keeps him steady. He makes simple things at last. Stools, keepsake boxes, little carvings of dogs people swear look like their own. On Saturdays, he loads them in an old crate and sells them at the flea market by the feed store. No haggling, cash only. Thank you. He keeps his head down. Always has. Folks in Grayford don't say much to his face. They talk in pairs on porch steps or over steering wheels at stoplights. That's the Army kid, someone whispers. Lives off checks. He pretends he doesn't hear. Grim knows when to ignore a voice and when to listen. The dog learned that overseas, and so did Silas. Nights are the worst. They come with thunder. That isn't weather. One moment he's in the shack. The next he's under a sky that breaks open. Metal, dirt, a name shouted and lost. He wakes standing, hands on nothing, throat raw. Lights flick on in the nearest house, then click off again. In the morning, he sands wood until his palms sting, and the world goes quiet. He walks to town after lunch, taking the shoulder where the gravel turns to dust. At Ashwood Diner, bacon grease and coffee drift through the door every time it opens. He hears them before the screen slaps shut. He's got that police dog trained to attack. My cousin says he never worked a day since he got back. The waitress tells him to hush. They don't. Silas keeps walking. Past the diner. The police station sits with a bulletin board under glass. A fresh notice curls at the corners. Weapon thief still at large. Could be a local. The words catch. Grim's ears tip forward. Silas studies a flyer a beat too long. Feels something cold move through his chest and thinks. They've already picked the face they want for it. He turns for home, the fog closing behind him like a door. The trouble started with a break-in nobody saw coming. A supply depot just outside Grayford Hollow got hit one night, and by dawn the word had rolled through town like smoke from a brush fire. Folks were rattled. Weapons were missing, real military stock, not hunting rifles or pawn shop pistols. People leaned in close to talk about it at the gas station and at Ashwood Diner, the way they do when they're scared and looking for a name to blame. By mid-morning, Silas could feel the wave of eyes on him. At the market, conversation stopped when he walked past. A man stacking cans at the hardware store muttered to his buddy, loud enough for Silas to catch, "Who else around here knows how to handle that kind of stuff?" The other man didn't answer, just shrugged towards Silas with a look that said plenty. Grim trotted steady beside him, tail low, ears moving like antennae. Down at the diner, the talk turned sharper. A woman in a denim jacket leaned across her coffee. That Harlow boy's not right. Always off by himself, never married, never steady work. He's got that old police dog, probably teaching it tricks we don't want around here. Laughter followed, but it was nervous laughter. Rumor spreads quick in a small place, and once it sticks, it hardens. That same week, a new face showed up in uniform. Maeve Calder, fresh from New Jersey, the kind of officer still figuring out which roads turn to gravel and which neighbors are worth trusting. She was assigned to help with the investigation. walking into it already carrying a bundle of whispers about Silas. She asked questions with a crisp tone, but in her eyes lingered the hesitation of someone who hasn't yet chosen who to believe. One afternoon, Grim was scratching the dirt behind the shack when he struck something hard. Silas pulled him back, but not before a couple of boys from town saw the corner of an old wooden box jutting out. By evening, the story had twisted into proof that Silas kept weapons buried out back. Truth was, inside the box were medals he never wore, service papers yellowed at the folds, and a notebook filled with cramped handwriting, names, dates, half-finished thoughts he could never say out loud. He closed the lid quick, carried it inside, and shut the door. It didn't matter. The next morning, Ashwood Diner hummed with certainty. "He's got a stash," someone said between bites of pie. "Explains why he lives like that." A man at the counter added, "He's the one. Bet on it." By lunchtime, the story had grown a tale. Someone claimed Silas had been seen near the depot the night of the break-in, though no one could say who had actually seen it. The police station received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet typed, accusing Silas Harlow of being tied to the theft. No proof, no signature. But in a town already restless, that was enough to tilt the scales of suspicion. Maeve held the paper in her hand. Unsettled, she thought about the man she'd glimpsed once or twice in town. Quiet, scarred by something she couldn't name. She wanted to ask questions face to face, but the gossip in her ear kept her cautious. Silas felt the circle tightening. He took longer routes home, avoided the diner, kept his head down even lower than usual. At night, he sat with Grim by the stove, running his hands over the old dog's coat as if grounding himself. The voices of the town, though muffled, pressed in through the walls. He told himself he'd learned to live with suspicion, that it was nothing new. Still, the thought dug at him. What if this time the talk carried him somewhere he couldn't walk away from? One evening, he returned from a long walk down the timber road. The shack was still, the air damp with the coming rain. Then he noticed it. Prints in the mud that weren't his, circling near the back steps. Heavy boots, fresh. Grim's hackles rose, a growl starting low in his chest. Silas lifted his eyes and saw, just beyond the tree line, a figure standing motionless. For a breath the shape held, then melted into the dark, leaving only the sound of branches snapping back. The drizzle didn't let up for days. It hung in the air like a wet sheet, laying over Grayford Hollow, until even the clapper houses looked swollen and tired. Fog clung low to the ground, not the soft kind you see in fields, but heavy and damp, a curtain you had to push through just to walk the main road. People moved slower, voices lower. The town seemed to hold its breath, waiting for someone else's mistake to prove them right. Inside the shack, Silas kept the fire going. The stove ticked and hissed as the rain drummed on the tin roof. He sat close, elbows on his knees, staring at a half-carved piece of maple. The knife rested idle in his hand. His mind wasn't on the wood. He kept seeing the box under his floorboards, knew exactly what was in it. The papers, the medals, the journal pages nobody else had ever read. Some days he thought about dragging it out and showing the world. Look, I try to tell the truth. But then he'd picture the fallout. Once those memories came loose, he couldn't pack them back away. Names of the dead, the look on their faces. The night a man he trusted walked away and left him to it. He rubbed his forehead with the heel of his hand. Grim shifted, came over, and set his head squarely on Silas's leg. The dog's weight was steady, almost stubborn, like saying, "You're still here." Silas let his hand fall into Grim's coat. That touch was the one thing that pulled him back from the edge when his thoughts started circling too dark. Outside, things are getting tighter. Patrol cars rolled past more often now, tires hissing on wet pavement. They slowed at the shack just enough to make sure he noticed. Once, the cruiser parked for a few minutes, engine idling, before pulling off. Silas watched from the window, chest tight. He knew what it meant. They weren't just looking. They were waiting for him to trip. The townsfolk had found their courage, too, in the wrong way. A group of young men from the diner cornered him one afternoon near the feed store. One stepped forward, smirking, and pitched a bottle that bounced off the dirt at Silas's feet. "Traitor," another muttered. The word landed harder than the bottle. Silas didn't answer. His hands balled without his permission, then unclenched. Grim pressed close, hackles raised, but Silas tugged him back and kept walking. If he fought, they'd get what they came for. Later that evening, Maeve Calder showed up at his door. She looked damp from the rain, hair pulled back, uniform jacket zipped. She tried to carry herself with authority, but there was something in her expression, curiosity, or doubt, that softened it. "I need to ask you a few things," she said, notebook in hand. Silas leaned against the doorframe. His eyes were tired, his voice flat. "Then ask." She hesitated, then asked about the depot break-in where he'd been, whether he knew anything about military weapons still floating around. Her tone was clipped, official, but her gaze flicked to Grim and to the scars on Silas's hands. He didn't offer explanations. He didn't try to win her. If you want to believe what they're saying, he told her, "Go ahead." The words dropped like a stone. Maeve shut her notebook slowly, studying his face as if she wanted to argue, but wasn't sure what to argue for. Then she left, boots crunching on the wet gravel. From inside, Silas watched her go, uneasy. She might turn out like the rest of them, or maybe not. He couldn't tell. Night dragged in, heavier than usual. The fire burned low, rain tapping steady. Silas dozed in his chair until the dream took him again. It was the same dream, only sharper this time. The unit pinned down, gunfire flaring, voices shouting over each other. Then silence and a figure slipping into the dark, leaving him behind. Faces of the fallen burned bright before fading. He woke with a gasp, shirt damp with sweat. Grim barked once, startled, then quieted, nose pushing against Silas's arm. Silas sat up, chest heaving. The name came out of him before he could stop it, hoarse and bitter. "Vance." It was the first time he'd said it aloud in years. The rain kept falling, but now it sounded different, like footsteps closing in. The rain never gave the town a break. By the end of the week, another theft was reported, this time bigger. Crates missing, locks smashed like they were toys. When the deputies traced tire marks through the wet dirt, the tracks curved back toward the woods, not far from Silas's shack. That was all people needed. The gossip hardened into a verdict before anyone checked a fact. At Hollow Hall, the community gathered. The old timber building creaked under the weight of voices raised higher than the storm outside. "How many times do we have to pretend we don't know?" One man shouted. "It's him. Harlow. He's the only one with training." Others echoed, pounding fists on folding chairs. "Arrest him now before somebody gets hurt." The sheriff tried to keep order, but the tide was against Silas. Silas didn't go. He stood at a distance, leaning against a tree line, hearing the muffled roar through the walls. It was enough. He turned back home with Grim padding beside him, the sound of his own boots heavy in the mud. The loneliness pressed harder that night. Not the quiet kind he chose, but the kind that pushed him to the edges of himself. The next morning, Maeve Calder was sent out with a task nobody else wanted: check his place. She parked the cruiser at the end of the rutted lane and walked up. Grim barked once, a sharp warning, before Silas called him down. Maeve stepped inside, eyes scanning the small space. She expected clutter or weapons. What she found instead stopped her short. The shack was lined with wooden work. A table sturdy enough to last a generation. Small boxes etched with names carefully burned into the grain. Carvings of dogs, each one distinct, one of them so clearly grim it almost seemed to breathe. She ran her hand lightly over a chair, the surface smooth, edges rounded by patience. "These yours?" she asked. Silas kept his gaze on the stove. Who else would have made them? There was no pride in his voice, only fact. Maeve looked at the carvings again and saw what they carried. Memory. Not trophies, not trinkets, but pieces of lives he didn't want forgotten. Grim moved toward her, muscles tight at first, then loosening. He sniffed her hand, gave a low rumble, then sat at her feet as if he'd made a choice. Maeve crouched, surprised, resting her hand on his back. "Guess he doesn't think I'm all bad," she said quietly. Silas finally looked at her, the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Dogs know better than people. While he checked the fire, Maeve's attention caught on a small box tucked on a shelf. Its lid was half closed. She hesitated, then lifted it just enough to see inside. Old photos. One in particular. A group of soldiers, arms slung over each other's shoulders, all grinning into the sun. She recognized Silas, younger, eyes brighter. But it was another face that held her, the man standing to his left. Scrawled across that face in heavy ink was a single X. Maeve slid the photo back before Silas turned around. She kept her expression even, but the image stayed burned in her mind. She didn't know the man's name, not yet, but she felt the weight of it. Maybe this whole story wasn't as simple as the town wanted it to be. She left soon after, thanking Silas without looking too long at him. On the ride back, she kept a hand on her pocket, where she'd slipped a copy of the photo into her notebook. She told herself it was part of the job, nothing more. But something told her the stranger with the crossed-out face mattered in a way she hadn't grasped yet. That night Silas sat on the porch with Grim, stretched at his feet. The rain had stopped, leaving the world slick and humming with insects. In the distance a truck rattled down the back road, its gears grinding. Silas stared into the dark trees, voice low enough it was more thought than speech. "We're never going to have peace. Oh, boy, not until the truth comes up for air." Grim shifted, ears pricked. Out beyond the timber, a flash of headlights pierced the branches, held for a moment, then vanished. Silas felt the prickle on his skin, the certainty of eyes on him. He sat straighter, hand resting on the dog's back, knowing the game was no longer about whispers. It was someone watching, waiting, moving pieces against him. The woods around Grayford Hollow held on to the cold that morning like a secret. A pale mist draped itself over the pines, rolling down into the hollows, until the earth seemed to breathe. Silas followed the dirt path with Grim trotting close, the old dog's paws dark with wet soil. The trail should have been empty, but halfway down he spotted the marks. Heavy tires, deeper than the ruts left by tractors, carved the mud and cut straight toward the derelict sawmill. He crouched, fingertips pressed the groove. Fresh, too fresh. Grim lowered his head to sniff, then lifted his muzzle, ears pinned back. Silas straightened, eyes locked on the direction of the mill. The Grayford mill hadn't run in decades, but the marks were clear. Someone had brought life back into that corpse of a building. He tugged the leash lightly, muttered, "Not now," and turned them home, though his mind stayed fixed on those tracks. Later that morning he carried his work into town, hoping the rhythm of routine would quiet the unease. The flea market smelled of fried dough and coffee, a thin comfort against the sideways glances he felt landing on his back. He laid out a small collection. Stools built square, a carved box, a chariot sanded until the grain shone like satin. Grim stretched out by his side. The peace lasted minutes. A group of young men, restless with the kind of swagger that feeds on weakness, circled his stall. One picked up the chair, turned in his hands as if appraising it, then slammed it to the ground. The leg snapped. Their laughter was sharp, mean. "Looks like your work's about as solid as you are," one of them said, voice low but full of edge. Silas's body remembered faster than his mind. Fists clenched, shoulders ready. He saw himself lunging, saw how quickly it could turn bloody. That picture froze him. The last thing he wanted was to prove their story true. He forced his hands open, pushed air through his teeth, and stared until the boys shifted back. Grim's growl, low and steady, sealed it. They scattered. From across the way, another voice cut through, female, deliberate. A woman in a plaid coat, middle-aged, arms folded across her chest. "If he's not hiding something, why doesn't he just leave?" she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The silence that followed hurt more than the laughter. Some nodded in agreement. Others avoided his eyes. Silas gathered what was left of his things, stacking the broken chair on top. Every step back to the truck felt heavier, as though the mud itself wanted him gone. That night, he couldn't let the tire tracks rest. The fog came thicker, swallowing the tree line, but he set out anyway, Grim at his heel. The road to the mill was silent, except for crunch of wet gravel underfoot. As he neared the building, he dropped into the brush. Diesel fumes lingered in the air, foreign and unmistakable. Voices carried, rough and clipped. Through the slats of the rotting wall, he saw them. Figures moved in and out, hefting crates stamped with numbers. Flashlight beams sliced through the dark, glinting off steel edges. Then, for breath, one light caught a face. Dorian Vance. The name pounded through him like a hammer. He hadn't seen that face since the night the desert swallowed their unit whole. He saw again now as if time had folded back, Vance walking away when the gunfire cracked, leaving men bleeding, leaving Silas to drag himself through sand and silence. The smirk was the same, carved into the man's expression even as he barked orders at the crew. Grim, shifted, body tense. Silas pressed him down with a hand. His breath came hard, but he forced himself still, eyes locked on the scene. He thought about going straight to the sheriff, slamming the truth down on the desk. But he could already hear the response. A veteran trying to smear someone else to save his own skin. They wouldn't believe him. They hadn't believed him then, either. So he stayed, crouched in the wet brush, watching as the trucks rumbled away into fog. The mill went quiet again, but the image of Vance burned bright, unshakable. When he got home, the shack felt smaller, the walls pressing close. He sat before the stove, fire snapping weakly. His eyes went to the shelf where the wooden box sat. Inside were files, the medals, the reports he had written, the ones ignored. His hand hovered near it, but never touched. To open it would mean dragging every ghost back into the room. Grim lay at his feet, chest rumbling with a growl that didn't stop. The dog's ears flicked toward the woods, as though he sensed a storm already circling. Silas leaned down, resting his palm on the thick fur. "Yeah," he whispered, voice rough. "I feel it too." Maeve showed up at his shack just as the morning fog was thinning. She didn't bother with small talk. Her hand was tucked in her jacket pocket, thumb pressing against the edge of the photograph she'd taken from his carved box. She stood there for a moment, then said quietly, "The man in that picture, the one with his face crossed out, was that Dorian Vance." Silas didn't answer right away. He leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, eyes set on a patch of woods as if the trees held a reply. Grim sat between them, gaze moving back and forth, tail still. Finally, Silas sighed. "Yeah, that's him." His voice was flat, but his jaw tightened. Maeve studied him, waiting for more. When he didn't continue, she pressed. "Why mark his face like that? What happened?" Silas dragged a hand through his hair, then stepped aside to let her in. The shack smelled of smoke from last night's fire and the faint resin of sawdust. He dropped into a chair, elbows braced on his knees. "Vance was my patrol leader. Last mission we ran together, it went to hell. He abandoned us when we needed him most. Men died out there, men I'd give my life for." He swallowed, eyes narrowing at the memory. "I made a report. I put it in writing, every detail. Next thing I know, the file's gone. No record. And suddenly I'm the one under suspicion. Rumors follow me home like shadows." Maeve's brow furrowed. She could hear the bitterness underneath, the way a wound still raw years later colored every word. "So all this talk around town, all this suspicion, you've been carrying it since then?" "Doesn't matter what I say," he muttered. "Truth got buried with those men." And Vance walked away clean. She leaned back, arms crossed. Inside, she felt a tug-of-war. Her badge told her to hand over the photo, to file a report, to follow procedure. But her gut whispered that Silas wasn't the monster people painted him to be. Vance's name felt heavier each time it surfaced. Something about him rang wrong. "I should turn this in," she said softly, almost to herself. "But I'm not sure the truth lives in the paperwork anymore." Silas looked at her then, sharp and weary all at once. "Do what you need to do, officer. Just don't expect me to beg." Maeve didn't answer. She slipped the photo back into her pocket and left without another word, though the doubt sat heavy on her shoulders. That night, the air was close. No wind to move the haze that clung to the woods. Silas and Grim finally drifted into uneasy sleep, fire crackling low in the stove. The crash came sudden, glass shattering, the whoosh of flame. Grim sprang up barking, deep and furious, as fire licked across the floorboards. Silas lunged for a blanket, smothering the flames, coughing on the smoke. But in the chaos, he saw shadows moving, men slipping through the door. One snatched a wooden box, tucking it under his arm. No! Silas roared, charging after them. He barely made it 3 steps before something slammed into the back of his skull. The world spun. He hit the floor hard, consciousness slipping like water through his fingers. When he came to, the fire was out, reduced to smoldering black streaks across the wall. His head throbbed, his hands shaking as he reached for Grim. The dog whined but stayed pressed against his side, unharmed. The box, though, was gone. Every report, every medal, every scrap of proof he had kept safe, stolen. By morning, sirens cut through the woods. Deputies stomped around the yard, pointing to scorched marks and footprints, muttering theories loud enough for Silas to hear. Looks like he tried to burn his own records, one said. Another shook his head. Self-sabotage, hiding something. The whispers turned quickly into statements, and statements into judgment. At Ashwood Diner, the story had already grown teeth. Silas Harlow had set fire to his own shack, desperate to cover up his crimes. By noon, the pressure was no longer rumor, but demand. Calls for his arrest rang louder than church bells on Sunday. Inside the charred shack, Silas sat on the floorboards, Grim's head resting against his chest. His arms wrapped tight around the old dog, his eyes red not from smoke, but from something deeper. He stared at the doorway, voice raw. "If we don't fight back," he whispered, his cheek pressed against Grim's fur, "they'll bury us all over again." Grayford Hollow was buzzing like a kicked hornet's nest. The fire at Silas's shack had given the townspeople more fuel than the flames ever did. At the diner, the conversations ran in circles. Some swore he had burned his own place to cover his tracks. Others claimed it was just a desperate act of a dangerous man who didn't belong in their quiet valley. By afternoon, a group had even called for the sheriff to lock him up before he'd take someone with him. Silas sat on the porch steps of what was left of his shack. Grim stretched his feet, ears twitching at every sound from the woods. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the war going on inside him. If he stayed silent, they'd keep branding him guilty, treating him like a shadow that never left the battlefield. But if he fought back, if he showed his rage, he feared the old instincts would take over. He had spent years trying not to be that soldier again, the one who only knew how to survive by force. He rubbed Grim's head, whispering into the dog's thick fur. "I don't know how much more I can take. Boy, if I stand up, they'll see a monster. If I don't, I'm already buried." Grim let out a low, steady whine, pressing closer, while Silas wrestled with himself. Maeve Calder was busy following a different path. The fire and the whispers didn't sit right with her. She'd grown up around cops. Her father had worn the badge for 30 years in Newark, and she knew how stories could be bent to fit the easiest villain. Something about Silas didn't fit the role everyone was shoving him into. Using one of her father's old contacts, she managed to pull a thread through the military system. Most of it was standard: unit rosters, deployment dates, casualty reports. But one detail caught her eye, a gap. A report filed around the same time Silas claimed he wrote about Vance. The entry existed on a list, but when she tried to open it, there was nothing. Erased, like someone had gone back in and cut the page clean out of the book. Maeve leaned back in her chair at the small police outpost, tapping her pen against the desk. She thought of Vance, the man in the photo whose face had been scratched through with such anger. If Silas was telling the truth, then this wasn't just about one veteran being bitter. It was about a cover-up, maybe even a network keeping its hands clean. But she couldn't bring that theory to her captain without proof. And proof was something slippery in Grayford Hollow these days. A couple nights later, she headed into the woods near the old Grayford Mill. The air was heavy with damp, the ground soft from days of drizzle. She kept her flashlight low, its beam cutting through the mist. She had followed rumors of trucks, and the tracks she found didn't lie. Deep tire ruts pressed into the mud, leading to a clearing. Her chest tightened when she saw it. A crude stash. Wooden crates stacked under a tarp, their corners damp and streaked with earth. She lifted the cover and found rifles, ammunition, even gear still stamped with military codes. Whoever had stolen from the armory had been busy. She crouched low, brushing her fingers over the mud-smeared surface of a rifle. That's when she saw it. Just near the trigger guard, faint but deliberate, was an etched H. A simple letter, carved in the same style she had seen on Silas's woodworking at the shack. Her breath caught. She turned the weapon in her hands, heart pounding. It was either the cruelest coincidence she'd ever seen, or someone had gone to the trouble of planting a signature only a few locals would recognize. "Damn it," she muttered, lowering the gun. She could hear her father's voice in her head. Evidence doesn't care about your gut, but her gut had been loud all week, telling her Silas was no criminal. And yet here it was, hard steel in her palm, carved with his mark. She stood there for a long while, flashlight flicking across the crates, the fog curling around her boots. If she took this back, it would be one more nail in Silas's coffin. But if she ignored it, she'd be betraying her duty. Maeve finally tucked the rifle under her arm and started back toward town. Each step sank into the mud, heavy with more than just her weight. The mist clung to her hair, and her thoughts circled like wolves. Was Silas Harlow the man her instinct insisted he was? A broken veteran caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or had Vance been clever enough to build a trap, so convincing it would turn even the most sympathetic ally into a doubter? By the time she reached the edge of the woods, her pulse hadn't slowed. She held the rifle tighter, staring at the letter carved into its frame. It felt like carrying a question she wasn't ready to answer. By morning, the air outside Silas's shack carried more than mist. It carried voices. A crowd of townspeople had gathered, their anger louder than the wind through the pines. "Get out of Grayford," someone shouted. Another voice harsher, "Man like him's got no place here." A stone flew, shattering what was left of a window pane. Grim sprang to his feet, teeth bared, a low growl rumbling in his chest. But Silas didn't move. He sat in the half-dark of his cabin, staring through the broken glass with eyes dulled by exhaustion. Hatred wasn't new to him. It had followed him home from the desert like a shadow. Eventually, the voices thinned. Tires crunched away on gravel. Silence settled again, heavy as the smoke-stained rafters above. Silas stayed where he was for hours, until the quiet became unbearable. That night, with his lantern burning low, he pulled out charred pieces of wood from the fire's wreckage. Instead of discarding them, he set to work. His knife traced lines into blackened oak, coaxing shapes from ruin. One figure became a soldier carrying another. Another piece turned into the likeness of a dog, head lifted, loyal even in stillness. And on every base, Silas carved names. Those he had served aside, those who had never come home. It was less craft than confession. Every cutaway of telling himself. The truth still lived here, even if no one else cared to hear it. The next day, Maeve showed up. She had the rifle in her hands, wrapped in a canvas sack, but her face betrayed the weight of it. "Silas," she began, her tone measured, "I need you to look at something." She unwrapped the weapon, showing him the etched letter near the trigger guard. "Does this mean anything to you?" His body stiffened. The carving was unmistakable, his mark, or at least a perfect copy. "I never touched that rifle," he said, voice low but steady. "But I know who would pull a stunt like this." Maeve waited. Silas drew a slow breath. "Vance. He was my patrol. Leader the night, everything went to hell. We were caught in a kill zone. He had the radio. He had the codes. And when we needed him, he vanished, left us to bleed in the dirt. Half the squad never got up again. I crawled out with holes in me and wrote the report, but when it reached higher command, it disappeared. And somehow, every whisper pointed back at me instead." His hands shook as he set the rifle down, not from fear, but from the rage he kept buried too long. Maeve said nothing at first. She was torn in two directions. Her oath as a cop demanded she turn over the evidence, and yet every instinct told a man before her wasn't guilty. She looked at the carvings stacked on his workbench, each one marked by grief and memory. This wasn't the labor of a criminal. Finally, she spoke. "If I give this to my captain, you'll be in a cell before nightfall. But if I don't, I'm breaking every rule I swore to follow." Silas met her eyes. "So you have to decide if you want to keep chasing rules or chase the truth. The room fell silent, except for Grim's steady breathing. Maeve turned the rifle over once more, then wrapped it again and set it aside. We go to the mill. Together. Quietly. If I'm wrong, I'll answer for myself. That night, they crouched in the tree line above Grayford Mill. The building loomed like a skeleton against a cloudy sky, its broken windows faintly glowing with the light of lanterns inside. Silas kept his eyes sharp, his hand resting on Grim's collar, steadying the old dog who strained forward at every sound. Engines rumbled. A line of trucks rolled out from the mill's back entrance, headlights cutting through the fog. Wooden crates were loaded into the beds, covered with tarps that couldn't hide their weight. Silas's gaze locked on the lead truck. For a heartbeat, the driver's face caught the light. Recognition slammed into him like a rifle but to the chest. Dorian Vance. The same smirk, the same cold eyes that had watched men die without lifting a hand. Silas's jaw clenched. His fist closed tight enough that the scar on his palm ached. He leaned close to Grim and whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Not this time. He's not bearing the truth again. Maeve shot him a glance, reading the fire in his expression, but she didn't speak. For now, both of them stayed in the shadows, watching the convoy disappear into the night. By late afternoon, the sky above Grayford had turned a bruised shade of green. The air felt heavy, swollen with the promise of storm. Wind bent the treetops along the ridge, and people in town rushed to tape windows, gather candles, and fill bathtubs. Everyone knew the power would cut out once the first lightning bolt struck. Inside his battered cabin, Silas sat hunched over, staring at the carving scattered across his table. The storm outside only mirrored the one inside his chest. He told himself the truth mattered, that it deserved daylight. But every time he imagined stepping forward, he heard the same echo in his head. You lived while they died. What if that was all anyone saw? Not a survivor. Not a man who tried to do right. Just the one who crawled out while better men stayed behind. He pressed his hands together until his knuckles ached. I don't know if I can carry it out there, he whispered. Grim rested his head against Silas's leg, his cloudy eyes soft but steady, as if to say the choice had already been made. Meanwhile, in town, Sheriff Rourke faced a different storm. The council chamber buzzed with townsfolk demanding action. He set fire to that shack himself. One man barked, "You're dragging your feet while he hides God knows what." Rourke raised a hand for quiet, his jaw set. He'd heard enough to know the crowd wanted blood, not justice. When he finally spoke, it was with the weight of office. "We're bringing Harlow in." Maeve stood in the back, arms crossed. She knew she should step forward and agree. Her badge demanded it, but she also knew too much. The reporter raced from the system, the rifle planted, the stormy look in Silas's eyes when he spoke of Vance. She couldn't let him be the scapegoat. When Rourke caught her glance, she held firm. "You don't have enough," she said flatly. "Not for a warrant." Her words earned her a dozen suspicious stares. Later, one deputy muttered behind her back, "Looks like she's already picked her side." That night, Silas made his choice. He strapped on his old boots, pulled on a rain jacket, and called Grim to his side. When Maeve arrived at the edge of the woods, flashlight in hand, he was waiting. "You sure about this?" she asked. "No," Silas admitted, tightening the strap on his pack. "But hiding hasn't worked out too well either." Grayford Mill stood like a husk against a boiling sky. Its tall frame rattled as the first sheets of rain fell, hammering tin and glass alike. Maeve and Silas crept through the underbrush, Grim padding close despite his stiff gait. The closer they got, the stronger the stench of oil and damp earth grew. Through a broken window, they saw rows of crates stacked high, government stencils still faint beneath the fresh paint. Weapons, enough to arm more than just a few men. Lanterns lit the cavernous space, throwing shadows across the damp floor. At the far end, a figure they both knew too well stepped into the light. Dorian Vance. His hair had grayed, but the arrogance was unchanged. He shook hands with a man Maeve didn't recognize, a broad-shouldered buyer with an accent thick enough to cut. Their words carried through the rain-muted space. "You'll have your shipment by next week," Vance promised. Silas leaned closer to catch every word. His boots scraped against a loose plank. The sound was small, but it carried. Vance's head snapped up. "We're not alone," he barked. Floodlights blazed. Armed men surged from the shadows. Maeve cursed under her breath. Silas shoved her back toward the door. "Move!" They sprinted through the mill, rain and thunder swallowing their footfalls. A shot rang out, splintering the wall inches from Maeve's head. Grim lunged at one of the men closing in, his growl fierce despite his age. The thug went down hard, cursing as teeth sank into his arm. Grim. Silas yelled, torn between going back and pushing forward. Maeve grabbed his arm. "He's buying us time, don't waste it." Together they burst into the storm, the rain instantly soaking them, mud sucking at their boots. The roar of engines rose behind them. Vance's men weren't letting go this time. But Silas didn't stop. Every step forward was fueled by the sight burned into him. Vance's smirk, the crates of stolen death, the truth he'd hidden for years. The storm tore through Grayford with a vengeance. Trees bent until they snapped. Power lines whipped and sparked. And then the whole town fell into a suffocating blackness. Only the flash of lightning tore the sky open, each strike throwing houses and barns into sharp relief before swallowing them back into dark. From his cabin, Silas watched the town below flicker out like dying embers. Somewhere out there people were lighting candles, gathering close, whispering against the howl of the wind. But what Silas saw wasn't Grayford. In his mind, it was a desert night, the firefight that had carved itself into his bones. Darkness, broken by fire, thunder replaced by mortars. He gripped the windowsill so hard it would crack under his fingers. His chest heaved as his breath quickened. Then something warm pressed against his shin. Grim. The old shepherd leaned his head in, his cloudy eyes steady, his fur damp from the storm creeping in through the cracks. The dog gave a low whine, as if reminding Silas, "You're here, not there." Silas dropped to his knees, resting his forehead against Grim's neck. The smell of wet fur pulled him back to the present. "I'm not there," he muttered, voice shaking. "I'm here. With you." Maeve burst through the door, rain dripping off her jacket. "Silas, we got trouble. Vance is coming." Silas rose, face pale but jaw tight. "How many?" "Enough to finish this. And the phones are out. No backup coming." For a moment, silence hung heavy. Rain hammered the roof, a steady drumbeat of inevitability. Then Silas nodded once. "Then we prepare." They started moving through the cabin, dousing lanterns, checking what could be used for cover. Grim paced the floor, restless but ready. As Maeve shifted a loose rug to wedge a chair against the door, her boot struck something hollow. She froze. "Silas, what's this?" "What's what?" Maeve crouched, pulling back the rug fully. Beneath it, a sliver would showed seams in the floorboards. She pried with the tip of her knife until the plank lifted with a groan. A hidden compartment revealed itself, packed tight. Inside were old folders, plastic sleeves, photographs, papers that smelled of mildew and dust. She held one up, her eyes narrowing. This is it, isn't it? The report you said vanished." Silas stood in the center of the room, suddenly looking years older. His throat worked, but words didn't come right away. Finally, he exhaled. "I thought burying it would make it die with them. No one wanted to hear it then. Maeve, I figured, why drag ghosts back just so they could be ignored again?" Maeve's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. There was a sworn statement, signatures, details of the ambush, and Vance's name written clear, tied to the betrayal. Photos of the squad, a fellow soldier's testimony, proof that Silas hadn't invented it all in grief. "You had this all along," she said quietly. Silas's eyes flickered with guilt. "And what would have happened if I shouted it from the rooftops? They would have called me bitter, delusional, easier to believe I was a failure than that one of their own turned traitor." Maeve shook her head. "This isn't about who listens. It's about who's willing to speak. Silas, this isn't just about you anymore. If he's running guns now, if he's killing to cover his tracks, this is the key to stopping him." Before Silas could answer, the sound reached them. The growl of engines, heavy boots sloshing through mud, muffled voices barking orders. The storm covered most of it, but the rhythm of armed men moving in unison was unmistakable. Silas reached for the folder and held it to his chest. His expression changed in that moment, grief and doubt giving way to something sharper. Resolve. He turned to Maeve, eyes no longer empty. "They think they're coming to bury me again," he said, voice low but steady. "Not this time." Maeve cocked her pistol, her jaw set. "Then let's make sure the truth doesn't go down with us." Outside, lightning split the sky, casting the cabin in white light. The roar of the storm mingled with the grind of truck tires on wet gravel. Grim stood at the door, teeth bared, a low growl rumbling from deep in his chest. The storm hammered the cabin, as if it meant to tear the roof right off. Wind clawed at the shutters, rain pounded the tin, and the door rattled against its frame. Outside, flashlights cut through sheets of water, bobbing like ghostly orbs. Boots squished in the mud, their rhythm steady, deliberate. Grim stood pressed against the door, fur bristling, a deep growl rolling for his chest with every step he heard outside. Silas stood in the middle of the room, clutching the folder to his chest. His face was pale in the flashes of lightning, his eyes hollow but steady. He had spent years hiding from his past, but the storm had driven everything to a point where he could no longer hide. His choices were laid bare. Keep the evidence tucked away and pray it survived long enough to hand the authorities, or confront Vance now, in the teeth of the storm, and risk losing everything. His hand shook slightly as he looked from Grim to Maeve. The dog's old eyes glistened, unblinking, steady as stone. Maeve, damp from rain and pale from exhaustion, stood with her pistol drawn, waiting for him to speak. Silas swallowed hard. "If I stay quiet tonight, Maeve will never get out from under this. They'll bury us in their lies again." Maeve's lips pressed tight, but she gave the slightest nod. "Then we make our stand." They set to work quickly. Silas dragged a heavy oak table across the floor, wedging it sideways to block half the doorway. Maeve scattered broken glass under the windowsill, sharp enough to slice through the boots of anyone who tried to climb in. Grim whined when Silas knelt to tie a strip of cloth around the dog's front leg. The shepherd licked his hand, tail swishing faintly. "Easy, boy," Silas whispered, voice thick. "Just one more fight." The storm shrieked through the cracks in the walls. Every gust made the cabin shudder. Silas lit a single lantern, dim and smoky, setting it near the far corner so shadows stretched long across the room. They both knew they didn't stand much chance in a straight fight, but sometimes shadows and angles could be enough. Maeve broke the silence. "Silas, if this goes wrong, if you don't make it, what do you want to do with that folder?" He didn't hesitate. "Get it out. Doesn't matter if they laugh at it, burn, deny it. You get it out to someone who'll print it, shout it, tape it on the church door if you have to." His jaw clenched. This time, the truth doesn't get buried. She studied him, rain dripping off her hair onto her cheek. "You realize if you fail, they'll call me as accomplice. I'll go down with you." Silas looked her in the eye. "Then you'll be the only one who stood for what was right. That counts for something." Her throat tightened, but she gave a short nod. "All right, then we stand together." The floor shook as boots stomped closer. Grim snarled louder, pressing against the door like he could hold it shut by sheer will. Lightning cracked overhead, and the world outside lit up for a split second. Silhouettes of 3 figures in rain-slick coats. The next moment the door blew inward, hinges snapping with splintering. Grim lunged forward with a bark that rattled the walls. Vance stepped in first. His raincoat clung to him, dripping, and in his hand gleamed a pistol already raised. His face, half shadowed in the lantern light, wore a thin smile. The years hadn't softened him. If anything, his eyes looked hungrier now, like a wolf finally cornering prey that stalked too long. "Well," he said, his voice rough but calm, "looks like you finally stopped running, Harlow." 2 men filed in behind him, broad-shouldered, rifles slung low. The smell of wet earth and gun oil filled the room. Silas stood his ground, the folder clutched at his side. His voice didn't tremble this time. "I'm not running anymore." Vance tilted his head, amused. "Then this will be quick." Lightning struck again, filling the cabin with blinding white. For that instant, everything froze. Grim poised a leap, Maeve's pistol raised, Silas steady as stone with the truth finally in his hands. The storm outside seemed to pound harder with every word. Rain lashed the broken windows. Thunder cracked so loud it rattled the floorboards, and in the middle of it all stood Vance. Soaked to the bone, pistol raised, eyes burning with cruel satisfaction. He tilted his head, voice low but cutting. "I gave you a chance to walk away back then, Harlow. I spared you. Tonight, I finished what should have been done years ago." Silas didn't flinch. He stood with his back to the wall, shoulders squared, his own pistol steady though his hand bled from a shallow cut. His voice came out cold, scraped raw. "You didn't spare me. You left me crawling through bodies, holding men you abandoned. You didn't give me life. Vance, you gave me nightmares." The words landed heavy, but Vance only sneered. With a sharp motion, he gestured his men forward. The cramped cabin erupted into chaos. Gunfire cracked, muffled by the roar of the storm. Sparks flew as bullets clipped the stovepipe. Splinters rained from the doorframe. Grim, with a furious bark, hurled himself at one of Vance's men. His jaws clamped on the man's arm, tearing through fabric and flesh. The rifle clattered to the floor. The man howled, stumbling back as the shepherd dragged him down. "Now!" Silas shouted, ducking low as Maeve fired a shot that cracked against the wall near Vance's head. It was meant to drive him back, to break his confidence. But Vance only advanced quicker, cutting the distance with Predator's focus. He slammed Maeve's arm against the wall, twisting her wrist until her gun slipped free. She cried out, the pistol falling useless at her feet. Silas turned to cover her, but was met with a boot to the chest from the second mercenary. He slammed against the table, the folder nearly slipping from under his coat. The breath ripped from his lungs as the barrel of a pistol pressed against his forehead. Vance loomed over him, rain dripping from his hair, voice almost tender in its cruelty. "You'll die tonight like the failure you've always been. No medals, no graveside honors. Just another ghost no one bothers to name." For a moment, Silas's chest heaved with the weight of it. The words dug deep, scraping at wounds that never healed. But then, in the faint lantern light, his lips curved into a bitter grin. A dry laugh tore from his throat. Wrong again. He ripped the folder from his coat and hurled it at Vance's face. Paper scattered across the floor, damp edges curling as they slid into the light. One page landed face up, official seal and signature gleaming in the flicker of the lantern. Maeve's eyes widened. There it was, undeniable, the truth in black and white, quick as lightning. She dove for it, snatching the page with both hands. She rose with her voice sharp and steady. "It's over, Vance. This is enough to bury you." Vance spun, pistol swinging toward her, but Grim, wounded and bloodied, launched himself again. His weight slammed into Vance's side, teeth snapping at the wrist of the gun hand. The pistol went off, deafening in the tiny room, the round punching harmlessly into the rafters. Silas surged up, driving his shoulder into Vance's chest. The two men crashed to the ground, grappling, fists and knees striking hard and clumsy in the cramped space. Vance snarled, reaching for his knife, but Silas pinned his wrist and hammered a fist into his jaw. Years of rage poured out, each blow shaking more than bone, breaking chains he carried since the war. At last, Silas wrenched the pistol free, flipping it around and slamming the butt against Vance's temple. The man went limp, blood mixing with rainwater across the floor. His mercenaries, wounded and groaning, were in no shape to rise. Silas staggered back, chest heaving, sweat and rain stinging his eyes. Grim collapsed beside him, sides heaving, muzzle flecked with blood but eyes still blazing with loyalty. Maeve pressed the papers against her chest, shaking but unbroken. On the floor, Vance stirred faintly, blood bubbling at his lip. Even defeated, his voice rose in a hoarse scream. "You think this changes anything? You think they'll let you live? They'll never allow the truth. The town, the brass, the whole damn system. They all want you gone, Harlow." His words cracked to the storm like another bolt of lightning, bitter and venomous. Silas leaned on the table for balance, his knuckles torn, his body trembling with exhaustion. He stared down at the man who had haunted him for years. His breathing slowed, steadied. He didn't answer Vance's rant. Instead, his gaze lifted to Maeve, to Grim, to the page clutched like a lifeline. For the first time, the evidence was no longer hidden in the dark. It was in the open, undeniable. The cabin no longer felt like shelter. It was a ruin, torn open by the storm. Shattered glass rattled in the frames. Rain slashed through broken windows, and blood mixed with muddy water across the warped floorboards. What had once been a place of exile now resembled a battlefield. Vance, though battered and bleeding, was far from finished. With a sudden lunge, he tore a knife from the belt of one of his groaning men. His eyes burned like a man who refused to die without dragging someone else into the grave. He slashed towards Silas with a raw, furious strength. Maeve pressed herself against the wall, clutching the damp folder to her chest as if it were her own heartbeat. Every flash of lightning lit her face, pale but determined. She knew if those pages slipped away, everything would vanish with them. Every life, every betrayal, every truth Silas had carried this far. On the floor, Grim wheezed, his chest heaving, muzzle stained with blood. The old dog's strength was nearly gone, but he still raised his head, a faint growl rumbling out. Silas's heart tightened at the sound. He glanced down for just a breath, the sight of his loyal companion twisting something inside him. Part of him wanted to drop the fight, crawl to Grim, shield him from the chaos outside. Yet he knew if he faltered now, all of this, the proof, the chance to end Vance, would drown in the mud. "Stay with me, boy," Silas whispered hoarsely, stepping forward with his fists clenched. Vance laughed, a jagged sound swallowed by the storm. "Look at you. You think you're any different from me? We both survived by climbing over the dead." Silas's jaw tightened. His voice, though raw, cut through the thunder. "No, I survived to remember them. You survived to bury them." The knife arced again, grazing Silas's arm, hot blood spilling down into the rain. Vance seized him by the collar and dragged him out the door. Both men crashed into the mud, rolling, striking, grunting as the storm swallowed their breath. The rain turned the ground slick. Every punch landed with the weight of old wounds and festering rage. Maeve stood in the doorway, screaming over the roar of the storm. "Silas, get up. Don't let him win." But she couldn't fire. Their bodies twisted too close. A single mistake could end Silas instead of his enemy. She could only clutch the folder tighter, her knuckles white, praying the man she'd chosen to trust would rise. Lightning tore the sky, illuminating their struggle in violent snapshots. Vance's blade flashing, Silas's arm blocking desperately, both faces grim with hatred. Mud clung to them. Rain plastered their hair against their skulls, their breaths ragged and gasping. With a savage shove, Vance slammed Silas onto his back, pinning him down with the weight of his knee. The knife pressed against Silas's throat, so close he felt the sting of steel-cut skin. Rain ran into his eyes, carrying thin streams of blood with it. Vance leaned in, his voice dripping poison. "Say it. Admit you were the thief. Tell me you took those weapons, and I'll let you crawl away. Maybe you'll even get to watch that mutt die slow." The knife bit harder against his neck. Silas could feel his pulse hammering beneath the blade. For a flicker of a moment, he thought of surrender, just for Grim, just to make an end. But then he caught Maeve's eyes through the rain, wide, desperate, full of faith that he wouldn't break now. Something inside him steadied. He drew in a breath, despite the steel and the storm, and forced a rough laugh. "Kill me if that's all you've got, but you'll never kill the truth." The words rang out, carried by thunder, defying everything Vance had built. Silas's gaze locked on his enemy, unblinking despite the blood dripping down his jaw. His voice was no longer just defiance. It was a vow. "The truth will outlive you." Vance snarled, tightening his grip on the knife, but there was hesitation in his eyes. The storm crashed around them. The ground shook with thunder, and Maeve's cries split the air. Silas lay pinned in the mud, rain and blood mingling down his throat, but his spirit stood unbroken. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one burning in his chest. The knife pressed harder against Silas's throat, cold steel breaking skin. Just as the world seemed to close in, a sudden growl split the storm. Grim, dragging himself across the wet ground with a last reserve of strength, lunged forward. His jaws clamped down on Vance's wrist with all the fury left in his aging body. Vance howled, his grip faltering. The blade slipped from his hand and splashed into the mud. Silas seized the instant. Muscle memories surged through him. The drills, the countless hours of close combat training, the fight for survival etched into his bones. He twisted, rolled, and slammed Vance onto his back, pinning him with a knee to the chest. Rain poured down their faces, blurring the line between blood and water. Silas's voice cut through the storm. "I could end you right now." His hands pressed harder against Vance's shoulders, forcing him deeper into the mud. "But I won't be your executioner. You don't get to vanish that easy." He turned his head, shouting over the roar of thunder. "Maeve, take the file. Show them the truth." Maeve clutched the folder tight, her chest heaving. For a heartbeat, she hesitated. Then she bolted from the doorway into the storm, boots splashing through the growing puddles. She lifted the sodden folder high, lightning illuminating the pages. "Here," she cried, her voice carrying across the chaos. "This is the proof. Look for yourselves." Through sheets of rain, flashlights flickered. A squad of town officers, led by the sheriff, had rushed toward the cabin after hearing the earlier gunfire. They stumbled to a stop, faces shadowed by the storm, staring at the sight of Maeve holding the file aloft. Behind her, Vance thrashed beneath Silas's weight, spitting mud and rage. "Don't listen to her," he roared, his voice cracking. "He's insane. He's always been insane. He burned his own shack. He set me up." But Maeve thrust the folder into the sheriff's hands. The man opened it quickly, rainwater running across the official seal stamped on the front page. His eyes tracked the bold signature of the long-dead witness, the photographs, the classified markings. His jaw tightened. For a long, tense moment, the sheriff said nothing. He only looked at Silas, kneeling in the mud, one arm still locking Vance down, and then back at the man pinned beneath him. Slowly, the color drained from his face. The storm seemed to pause in its fury, as though waiting for the verdict. Silas barely noticed. His chest heaved with exhaustion, mud clinging to the skin, blood trickling from his neck. Beside him, Grim collapsed against the wet earth, eyes glazed with pain but steady with loyalty. Silas glanced at the old dog, and a pang cut through his heart. Even broken, even dying, Grim had fought for him. That loyalty had saved his life. The sheriff snapped his fingers at his men. "Cuff him." Hands grabbed Vance's arms, twisting them behind his back. He shouted, cursed, kicked against the mud, but the cold bite of steel closed around his wrists. His voice rose above the storm in one last, venomous cry. "This won't change a damn thing. They'll never let you live in peace. Not the town, not the army. You'll always be hunted." Silas didn't rise. He stayed kneeling in the mud, watching as Vance was hauled to his feet. His voice, low but steady, carried over the rain. "Maybe, but at least this time I didn't stay silent." Lightning ripped across the sky, casting the scene in harsh light. Vance, dragged away in irons, Maeve, soaked to the bone, standing tall with relief etched on her face, Grim lying close to Silas, eyes half shut yet calm, and Silas himself, scarred and weary, but no longer just a shadow hiding on the edge of town. The storm raged on, but something in that moment felt washed clean. The mud, the blood, the years of silence, all of it was being carried away in the torrent. Vance was shoved into the back of a police truck. The door slammed shut. He twisted one last time, eyes burning with undying hatred. This isn't over. Silas looked back, rain dripping from his chin, his voice quiet, resolved. It is for tonight. Morning came slow, gray and heavy over Grayford Hollow. The storm had spent itself, leaving the town soaked and broken in its wake. Power lines drooped like tired soldiers. Tree branches littered the streets, and puddles stretched across cracked asphalt. The smell of wet earth mixed with smoke from the wreckage of Silas's shack, a bitter reminder of how close the night had come to swallowing everything. What remained of the cabin was little more than a skeleton, blackened beams, warped boards, and the faint curl of steam rising as the damp morning pressed against charred wood. Yet Silas was still standing, battered but alive. Grim lay at his side, chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The old dog had survived, though each movement was a strain. Silas crouched beside him, resting a hand on his fur, whispering words too soft for anyone else to hear. Down in the center of town, the aftermath of the night carried a different weight. Vance, bound in cuffs, was loaded into a van that would take him out of Grayford for good. His face twisted with rage and promises of unfinished business. But his words had lost their grip. The charges were too heavy now. Arms trafficking, betrayal of his own unit, attempted murder. The sheriff, who had once pressed hard to condemn Silas, stood with shoulders slumped. He looked at Silas across the muddy lot, rainwater dripping from the brim of his hat. "You were right," the sheriff admitted, the words dragging from his throat like stones. "You weren't the criminal here. Guess I owe you more than an apology." Silas only nodded. He had no interest in apologies. What mattered was that the truth was finally out where it could not be buried again. News had already begun to spread beyond the town lines. This wasn't just Grayford's problem anymore. Higher authorities would have to answer questions they'd tried to bury for years. And yet, even with Vance gone and the record cleared, the deeper fight lingered in Silas's chest. The old guilt, the feeling of being the one who lived while others didn't, clung to him like a shadow that the storm couldn't wash away. He watched people gather along the edge of the lot, townsfolk who had once jeered at him, who had whispered that he was dangerous, worthless. Now they stood with expressions twisted by doubt, by shame, by something that looked almost like regret. He felt their eyes, but didn't flinch from them. For years he had carried their hatred, as if it was his due. Today, their silence felt different. Not condemnation, but uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, something inside him eased. A boy broke away from the crowd, thin, maybe 10, with mud on his sneakers. Silas recognized him as the son of the man who had hurled the first stone at his window days earlier. The boy clutched a piece of wood, jagged and splintered, clearly torn from the wreckage of the cabin. He held out with small, nervous hands. "My dad said you can carve things," the boy mumbled, barely audible. "Could you make something out of this?" "For me?" Silas took the fragment, turning it in his palm. It was nothing but a broken scrap, but the boy's eyes carried hope and apology. Silas nodded once. "Yeah," he said softly, "I can do that." It was a simple request, but it settled deep in his chest. Maybe redemption didn't come from clearing your name in front of the world. Maybe it came one gesture at a time, like a boy offering a piece of ruined wood as if it could still hold meaning. Maeve stayed close, her coat still damp from the storm, her eyes tired but steady. She'd stood beside him when no one else would, and she'd paid for it with suspicion from her own colleagues. Yet she didn't talk about leaving. When the sheriff asked if she'd transfer out, she only shook her head. "Grayford needs someone who won't look the other way," she told Silas as they stood among the ruins. "And I'm not about to run." There was no rush of romance between them, no sudden declaration in the wake of shared survival. What bound them was steadier. Trust forged in fire and rain, a bond that did not need to be spoken out loud. As the sun finally broke through the thick clouds, Silas stood before what remained of his home. Grim eased up beside him, leaning his weight against Silas's leg. Silas bent to scratch behind his ears, then straightened and looked at the blackened beams. "I guess we start again," he murmured. He picked up a plank that hadn't been destroyed and set it upright, balancing it against the frame. It was a meager beginning, but beginning all the same. Each nail, each salvage board, would be part of more than a cabin. It would be part of rebuilding himself. Maeve watched quietly. The boy lingered with wide eyes, and the town stood uncertain at the edge of the clearing. Silas didn't wait for their approval. He no longer needed it. The act of lifting that first piece of wood was enough. And with Grim at his side, scarred but unbroken, Silas stepped into the work of rebuilding. Not just a cabin, but a life no longer lived in silence. A few weeks later, Grayford Hollow looked different. The wreckage of the storm had been cleared, power lines restored, and the heavy silence that had once hung over the town seemed lighter somehow. On a crisp Saturday morning, townsfolk gathered at Hollow Hall, the old community building with creaky floors and tall windows that caught the late autumn sun. Inside, long tables were lined with displays. On one side stood Silas's carvings, rough-hewn but full of heart, wooden plaques etched with the names of fallen soldiers, small figures of men caught mid-step, and dogs carved in careful detail, their loyalty captured in the grain of oak and pine. There were simple benches and chairs, too, each one scarred but sturdy, built from salvage beams of his old cabin. People ran their hands across the wood, whispering about how something broken had been turned into something worth keeping. On another wall hung the documents, copies of the reports, photographs, and signatures that had cleared Silas's name. The sheriff had agreed to let them be shown as a public record, a stark reminder that truth had been buried in plain sight for too long. Folks leaned close, reading in hushed voices, shaking their heads at corruption and betrayal spelled out in ink. For Silas, standing in the middle of it all was both strange and humbling. Just months ago, the same neighbors had avoided his eyes or muttered insults under their breath. Now, one by one, some of them stepped forward. An older woman, who had once pulled her grandson away whenever Silas walked by, pressed her lips together before speaking. "I was wrong about you," she said quietly, her hands trembling as she held them together. Silas met her eyes, then gave a small nod. No long speeches, no blame. Just a silent acknowledgement that the past couldn't be undone, but maybe it didn't have to be carried forever. Others followed, some with words, some with little gestures. A man clapped him gently on the shoulder. A young couple thanked him for his service. Not everyone came forward, and he didn't expect them to, but enough did that he felt the shift, like the town itself was exhaling after years of holding its breath. Grim, limping slightly but still strong in spirit, stole the spotlight more than once. Children crouched to pet him, and adults called him a hero. His fur was grayer, his eyes clouded with age, yet he wagged his tail at every touch. For Silas, watching Grim bask in affection felt like justice of its own. The dog had carried his burden silently, and now he was finally seen for what he was. When it came time for Silas to speak, he hadn't planned anything. Maeve stood at the side of the hall, giving him a small nod of encouragement. He stepped forward, the wooden floor creaking under his boots. His voice was rough at first, but steady. "The truth is never easy," Silas began, glancing at the crowd. "It can be hidden, twisted, buried under lies for years. But if we hold on to it, if we refuse to let it go, it will find its way back into the light." He paused, scanning the faces before him. "I didn't survive so I could be called a hero. I survived because someone had to tell what happened. And if there's anything I've learned, it's this: silence only helps the ones who want to keep the truth buried." No applause followed, only a deep, respectful quiet. It was more than enough. Later that evening, children ran laughing near Silas's rebuilt cabin. It was no longer whispered about as a haunted shack on the edge of town. Now it was a place of warmth, with a sturdy porch and smoke curling gently from a chimney. Silas sat on the steps, a piece of wood in his hands, carving slowly. Grim lay stretched beside him, tired but at peace, his head resting against Silas's boot. The sky above Grayford finally cleared. Sunlight spread across the cabin in the yard, gilding the damp earth with gold. Silas felt as though he could breathe, without weight pressing against his chest. But peace, as Maeve knew, rarely lasted long. Days after the exhibition, she found an envelope in her police mailbox. No return address, no signature. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in clean, sharp letters. Vance was only one link in the chain. The rest runs deeper than you think. Maeve read the words twice, then folded the paper back into the envelope. She looked out the station window toward the line of trees beyond the road. Somewhere in that quiet, another storm was already gathering. For now, Grayford rested, but the story was not finished. And Silas, whether he wanted it or not, was no longer just a man on the margins. He had become part of something larger, something that would not let him disappear again. At the end of it all, Silas's journey reminds us that truth may bend under the weight of fear, but it never truly disappears. It waits for someone brave enough to carry it back into the light. Maybe that's the real measure of courage. Not just surviving battles, but daring to face the silence afterward. What about you? If you held a truth the world didn't want to hear, would you have the strength to speak it? If the story moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next journey we'll share together.